Hey everyone, this is Dr. Scott Haggerty with the Elite Family Chiropractic Podcast. And we are going to talk about something that's probably pretty controversial today. But I think it's an important conversation that we as parents and consumers have. Because most people don't know this, but vaccines are the only consumer product class of any type that is broadly shielded from civil liability, first nationally, now internationally. And in this longer form episode, we're going to map out the global timeline, tracing all the way back to 1961, all the way through 2021, and explain the rationale and the trade offs, follow the money and the conflicts, examine public health trend lines without overclaiming causation, and lay out what real accountability should look like for us. Now, this episode discusses law, policy, and public health history. It is not medical or legal advice. I will solely cite mainstream verifiable sources where possible. Correlation is not causation. The goal is better governance and transparency, period. So now think about it like this. If a car's airbag fails, you can sue the automaker. If a power tool explodes, you can sue the manufacturer. If a prescription drug causes undisclosed harm, civil courts can force discovery and sometimes billion-dollar accountability. In country after country, in the US, UK, Japan, Germany, Denmark, France, China, governments remove most of the manufacturer's liability and replace it with no-fault compensation schemes as it relates to vaccines. And in 2021, the WHO, who helped launch the first global version of this model, a thing called COVAX, has now been in place internationally. And this is something that I think we need to know about it because most people are wholly unaware. When I have conversations with people that are patients of ours, people that we know, even many folks in the healthcare industry don't know this exists. So today I'm going to map out that story, how we got here, who benefits, what changed, and what accountability could look like without resorting to speculation. Let's dive into it. So civil liability isn't just about payouts. It's the engine that forces safety improvements and pulls internal documents into daylight. When an industry is structurally shielded from the full force of tort law, three things can happen. Number one, incentives tilt away from relentless safety optimization. Two, less adversarial discovery means the public sees less. And three, power concentrates among manufacturers, regulators, and global health bodies, often with overlapping interests. So vaccines are the outlier. Governments created no-fault compensation programs, state or levy funded, so injured people can apply for benefits without proving negligence, while manufacturers are largely insulated from product liability lawsuits. No other consumer product category enjoys such a broad, durable protection in so many countries, and now via WHO's COVAX no-fault compensation program now across borders. We're going to cover a global timeline, the stated rationale, the observed trade-offs, money and influence, conflicts and cases, the 2019 through 2021 coincidence window, and finally, governance fixes that preserve vaccine access while restoring transparency and deterrence. So let's start here. I want to start with the timeline. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of take you through history so you know what's happened. So let's walk through the milestones. So first, starting in 1961 in West Germany, the first modern no-fault vaccine injury compensation framework was laid out for mandated vaccines. The state compensates the individuals, not the manufacturer. In 1963-64, France creates their law, and it's law number 64-643, and this integrates compensation into the public health code for injuries linked to state-required vaccines. 1976-77 in Japan, the preventative vaccination law adds compensation for unavoidably abnormal side effects, with the program launching in 77 and later consolidated into the Immunization Act. 1978 in Denmark, the Compensation for Individuals Injured by Vaccines Act established a national no-fault scheme, today handled through the patient injury system. In 1979 in the United Kingdom, the Vaccine Damage Payments Act creates a lump sum benefit for severe permanent disability following specified vaccines. You can still sue in civil court, but awards are offset. In 1986 through 88 in the United States, amid a liability crisis, Congress passes the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, creating the VICP, a federal no-fault tribunal funded by a per-dose excise tax. Since 1988, the U.S. program has paid several $billion in compensation to families. Now, fast forward. In 2019, China, right before COVID, created the Vaccine Administration Law. And it's adopted in June and takes effect in December 1st, establishing a national vaccine compensation framework weeks before COVID emerges. Now, March 2020, the United States has has their first reaction, which is the HHS Health and Human Services issues a PrEP Act declaration, which is granting sweeping liability immunity for COVID-19 countermeasures. And this is to manufacturers, distributors, and administrators, except for willful misconduct. In February 2021, the WHO goes even a step further with their COVAX. And what they do is they launch the COVAX No Fault Compensation Program, which is the first international vaccine injury program funded by a per dose levy for 92 economies, explicitly designed to reduce legal risk for manufacturers while compensating for serious adverse events. By 2021, we had National Shields plus an international protection program, something no other consumer product class has ever had in the history of the world. Now, why did lawmakers do this? Well, one, to maintain supply. In the US, during the 1980s, lawsuits threatened the viability of some vaccines. The fix was to move disputes into a specialized tribunal funded by an excise tax, which would stabilize supply and pricing. Number two, fairness to the injured. If society benefits and sometimes mandates vaccination, then people who suffer rare, serious adverse events should be compensated without proving negligence. That's the ethical premise that they used. Three, consistency and speed. Injury tables, expert review, and standardized criteria avoid injury variability and protracted litigation. Next, the trade off. Those benefits come with what's called reduced tort discovery and cost shifting to taxpayers, or pooled levies. In plain English, less courtroom scrutiny of manufacturers and a socialized cost of harm. So, what changed then after these shields were put in place? Well, A, more products, bigger schedules, and of course, a bigger addressable market. As new vaccines were added, you have things like the Hib, Hep B, pneumococcal, the rotavirus, HPV, annual flu shots, and all these things were added. And at the same time, the vaccine market grew dramatically. WHO's 2024 Global Vaccine Market Report catalogs dozens of products across more than 200 countries and well over 100 manufacturers. Global sales now are in the tens of billions of dollars annually. B, compensation confirms rare but real injuries. The US Vaccine Injury Compensation Program has paid out billions since 1988. COVID era claims typically run through a different mechanism, the CICP. In this case, many other countries have their own schemes. These payments are an official acknowledgement that serious adverse events happen, rarely, but they do happen. Now, there's the incentives puzzle. When manufacturers face less risk of civil discovery and damages, the external pressures to surface safety problems shift to public watchdogs and regulators. That can work if oversight is truly independent and transparent. If not, gaps appear. And this is where this starts to become a real problem, because now the accountability goes down because the consequences are significantly less because there's not real tort discovery required anymore. So let's talk about a couple of things that are just mainstream topics, right? Let's go through some of the public health trend lines. I want to talk very carefully about population level health trends. So these are correlations, not proofs of causation. So if you look at one of the most common mainstream conversation, autism diagnosis, in US, in US, 8-year-olds diagnosis of autism rose from 1 in 150 in 2000 to 1 in 36 in 2020, with newer cycles trending quite a bit higher. Experts cite things like expanded diagnostics, awareness, and services. Major reviews do not establish vaccines as a cause, and that in itself is a controversial statement to say this. Food allergies also went up dramatically. Things like peanut, tree, and nut allergies more than tripled between 1997 and 2008. Pediatric food allergy prevalence rose sharply from 1997 to 2011, and again 2007 to 2021 in those windows in particular. A lot of people don't understand why, but there are adjuvants that are added into the vaccines that trigger the immune system to react. Many of those are the common allergens, things like peanut and egg albumin and gluten, or all of those are used as adjuvants in many of the vaccines. Then things like autoimmunity markers, like ANA, anti-nuclear antibodies, increased in the US, and surveys from 88 to 2012 showed a massive increase, including among adolescents. Now, these trends overlap with expanding vaccine programs and entrenched liability shields. But again, we're not talking saying this proves vaccines cause them. What they do justify stronger independent safety surveillance is needed. Open data access for outside researchers should be in place, and a culture that threatens legitimate questions as fuel for better science is not a good thing, right? It's not. It's treated oftentimes as heresy, which it shouldn't be. We should be asking questions and proving these things, saying, is there a connection? Because ultimately, what's at stake is our kids. And I think it's not harmful for us to, as a society, to ask, is there any kind of interconnection between these things? Has there been some kind of a connection? Has there been a trigger? When you look at a lot of these things and you've never seen these kind of trends in human history before, that these kind of things are starting to present themselves at such high levels, what else has changed? And environmentally, not a lot. Like our environment is generally speaking become cleaner. So where would these things being triggered from? So we should look at these things with a critical eye and ask, is this possible? Now, what I want to talk about next is I want to talk about things like money and influence. So let's just take a look at something as simple as market power. Right now, a handful of multinational companies dominate key products, right? And the pandemic really supercharged revenues from many of these companies because of the massive amount of public procurement, right? Because the government was buying these, as was every other government, in mass, driving record profits for every pharmaceutical manufacturer that got a COVID-19 vaccine to market. Let's take a look at lobbying. In the US, pharmaceutical and health products sector is the top lobbying spender by a long shot. And this is for decades running, with billions invested and a high share of lobbyists who are former government staff. It's interesting, right? It's like a revolving door. They go from working for the government to working for a pharmaceutical manufacturer, and so they know the ins and outs. And let's take a look at this. For example, a former CDC director became president of a major vaccine division. And this is grabbing headlines quite recently. And while legal, it reinforces public perception of regulatory capture. You have to start asking yourself, is there a conflict of interest in place? And if you follow anything that's happened, these conflict of interest issues are becoming a big issue with what Robert F. Kennedy is doing throughout HHS now, because he's exposing these conflicts of interest in a different way. Most people weren't aware that these are there. And I can tell you, when I first learned about these conflict of interest issues, it blew my mind. And why this matters is, when the promoter, the purchaser, the mandator, and the adjudicator of injuries are all intertwined and the manufacturer is largely shielded, we've concentrated the power in an accountability sparse environment. That is a governance problem, not just a medical one. So we have to look at this and say we need to start reevaluating how these things are governed. And that is a structural problem with the way this legislation has shielded a lot of these industries, a lot of these folks within the industry from true scrutiny. And I think that needs to be evaluated. So let's take a look at some of these things, because if you look at some of the scandals and the conflicts that we've seen, many of them have become public, right? Let's take a look at within the WHO, there was an H1N1 vaccine, where there was an investigative work document due to because of undeclared financial ties among some pandemic advisors and manufacturers of antiviral vaccines. The WHO ended up facing a lot of issues because of transparency issues. They weren't being transparent with the public, with the legislators. It was a big issue. In China in 2017, a former deputy head of the national regulator was jailed for taking bribes from vaccine makers to speed approvals. And on the record case of regulator industry corruption, right? This is something that happened with someone who was working for the government who was being paid off by a manufacturer. So this is corruption on both ends, right? The vaccine manufacturer paying off the government to try and get a vaccine through faster. Merck's mumps litigation. This was in 2024, so more recently. A U.S. appellate decision found the Merck immune from antitrust liability under the Noer-Pennington doctrine in a case alleging misrepresentation to the FDA about mumps vaccine efficacy, illustrating how petitioning government protections can shield firms even when facts are disputed. So this is a problem, right? You've got an organization like Merck being challenged about the efficacy of the vaccine and all of these things, and the safety of the vaccine, and yet we can't do anything to litigate this because they are shielded by this piece of legislation. Now, listen, these don't prove a grand conspiracy, but they do show how In a liability light environment, transparency gaps and perverse incentives can flourish unless strong independent government oversight exists. And there's a lack of this with these things being put in place because there's no way to hold anybody accountable. And that becomes a huge problem. Now, let's take another look forward here because obviously we have to look at all these things and these timelines and start, many of you by this point may have said, huh, that timeline that we laid out was awfully coincidental. So 2019 to 2021, right? That was the timeline here where like that was right before and after the start of COVID. So here's where like when I started looking into this, what really caught my attention. So first in 2019, China finalizes the Vaccine Administration Law. It was adopted June 29th, 2019, effective December 1st, 2019, with a national compensation liability framework. Then, in March, COVID 19, well, earlier for them, but March for us, COVID 19 emerges weeks later, and the US PrEP Act declaration in March 2020 triggers blanket immunity for all COVID countermeasures. So you've got China putting in place their liability law right before the COVID outbreak occurs. Then COVID happens. And then once COVID is already in process, the WHO then has their COVAX no fault compensation program put in place in February of 2021, which is the first ever global vaccine injury mechanism, explicitly framed to reduce legal risk for manufacturers while compensating serious events in 92 different countries. Now, what this proves simply is that by 2021, the world had an unprecedented national plus international liability shield for only one product class, the only one in the entire world. What it does not prove, that policies were timed to a pandemic by design. It's we're looking at temporal sequence. It's not necessarily equal to intent. But in governance, I think optics matter, and I think incentives matter. I think what we have to look at it critically is say this is a very coincidental timeline, and should we, as a parent group, as a population, be concerned how these things happen to stack up coincidentally in time? So I'd like to propose what I think perhaps some solutions would be. Right, what accountability would actually look like if we want stable supply and public trust. Here's a practical checklist. Number one, there needs to be mandatory conflict of interest transparency with publication and meaningful recusal rules at national and WHO advisory boards. And I think this is something that with what's happened with the WHO, what's happened with the CDC, this has been, this is no longer happening. There's not mandatory conflict of interest protection. And you have, multiple folks that were fired from the CDC recently because they were dual payrolled. Many of them were making more money from patents they received and from their jobs with the vaccine manufacturers they were making from the government. Things like publishing procurement and indemnity clauses. Obviously these things can be safely redacted, but so the public understands who bears risk. Number three, independent post-marketing surveillance with open, de-identified safety data for outside replication and challenge. We have to be able to look at these things. We have to be able to go and see all the studies that are being done. And this just isn't happening. And then there needs to be targeted liability access. If you don't allow civil suits for design defects or proven fraud, this is harmful. If you keep the no-fault path for speed, but reintroduce a narrow tort backstop you can do this to restore deterrence. You have to put mechanisms in place. If you want to call it greater good, right? You have to put things in place that allow people to hold the manufacturer accountable. Otherwise, they have no reason, no mechanism to improve the product to make it safer. And that, I think, in itself is a huge, huge issue. That's why these laws need to be revisited. And there's also things called sunset reviews of emergency declarations and compensation frameworks. These extraordinary shields should require extraordinary recurring justifications. So these steps don't deny vaccines. What they do is they defend governance and ultimately defend trust. And that's where we, I think, as a population, are probably having the biggest issues right now. By not having the right things in place to keep transparency. Many people, as your eyes are becoming open to this, trust has to be put into question, because how can you look at this and not say this puts a modicum of doubt? And let's just frame it differently. If you were in a position yourself, you are working for the federal government and you're in a position to review a drug like a vaccine, and you have a job with the government and you are on the payroll of a vaccine manufacturer as a consultant or whatever it works out to be as, and you are working on one of their products for review for release to market, and they're putting pressure on you, and you look at the amount that they're paying you, and that amount may be as much as or more than what you're making from the government. All you have to do is say, is there a possibility that even in the best of situations, I could be influenced to maybe do things that would shield that manufacturer? Not saying anybody would, but I'm saying it creates doubt that if you're in that position that you may be influenced to do things you wouldn't normally do. And here's where the problem becomes: conflict of interest like this creates this kind of doubt I think that we should all naturally have for people who are in these positions, because whether or not they disclose it, a conflict of interest creates morality concerns. Would you always do the right thing in every situation 100% of the time, no matter how much money is at stake for you individually? And as much as I would like to say that I trust everybody, I don't. I think you have to look critically and say, there is a lot of people with that much money on the line who are going to make decisions to shield the manufacturer, to push something through and perhaps protect from data. Sorry about that. So when you look at things like what we talked about today, vaccines, sorry guys, vaccines reduced immense infectious disease burdens. And I think there's a lot of good that can happen from that. I don't think they need to be eliminated. What I do think in reality is I think that there is a lot of things that we have not been told, right? That can be true. And it can also be true that we built a liability architecture, national and global, that now asks the public to accept unusual levels of trust without usual levels of accountability. And a product class that governments recommend, purchase, and sometimes require should be held to the highest standards of openness. And I think this is where we're at, is we're at the lowest. That's not anti-science, that's pro-integrity. If this episode helped you connect the dots, share it with someone who cares about public health and good governance. The goal isn't to inflame fear, but it is to raise the bar. Because ultimately, it is our kids that are the ones that are at stake in these things. They're the ones who are getting the elevated schedules. And I just think we have to look at it and say that if there is not transparency, when you have adults who may make self-serving decisions, governments that may make self-serving decisions, when there's this much money tied up in this, I just don't think that you can look at it and say there's not things that we have to question. I think we have to reevaluate how this works, put better mechanisms in place for transparency. And I think you can't ever have a product class without liability. I think it is just absolutely tantamount that we create a liability structure where every company of every type in the entire world has to be held accountable for harm. So take that for what it's worth. I hope this informed you. I hope it gave you some things to think about. I will link the studies and things like that I used here for reference, so you can check this out for yourself. Don't take my word for it, right? All of these things are things I wanted to bring to your attention because I think most people have never been exposed to this. I hope it gives you value. I hope it opens your mind. I hope it inspires you to look deeper into this and maybe question things. And, from here, whatever you do with it is completely up to you. My goal is simply to create a conversation to give you ways to look at this that maybe you haven't, open your mind to things that maybe you didn't know about, and help you to better protect your children. All right. This is Dr. Scott Haggerty from Elite Family Chiropractic. Thank you guys so much for listening. God bless you, and we'll see you in the next one.